Today, we are closing the market for military-grade assault weapons in Canada.
Remember all those emotional speeches about taking assault weapons off our streets? Well, the latest government records suggest they may have been taking a lot more firearms off store shelves than off the streets.
These are firearms designed for war, for killing people.
You can't be serious about being tough on crime if you're not willing to be tough on guns.
The Liberals called it public safety, but the paperwork makes it look an awful lot like inventory management of stranded assets. For years, the Liberals have insisted their gun confiscation program was about one thing: getting dangerous firearms off our streets. The implication has always been that ordinary Canadians would willingly hand over these firearms because they had suddenly just become far too dangerous for us to own and keep in our gun safes after we are vetted daily by the government. Well, thanks to a newly released access to information request by us here at Rebel News, we're finally getting a better look at who's actually participating in this program. And the numbers tell a very different story. According to documents released by Public Safety Canada to Rebel News through our access to information filings, just 187 businesses participated in the federal assault-style weapons compensation program during its initial phase, claiming compensation for 12,143 prohibited firearms. Now let's stop and think about that for a quick second. That's an average of 65 firearms per participating business. Now compare that to the image the Liberals have spent years selling to Canadians. Worried gun owners cleaning out their safes for the good of public safety. But that's not what these numbers actually suggest. They suggest something else entirely. The federal government has frequently pointed to the number of firearms declared by individual owners under the compensation program, saying more than 67,000 firearms had been declared. But declaration is not the same thing as surrender. Throughout the program, with the help of our friends at the Canadian Coalition for Firearms Rights, owners were allowed to amend or withdraw their declarations. Thousands of firearms were later undeclared as owners changed their minds. In other words, we still don't have a clear picture of how many firearms individual Canadians have actually surrendered. What we do know, however, is this. The business stream alone accounted for more than 12,000 firearms, or about 15% of the combined business claims and individual declarations, remember declarations not surrenders, reported by the federal government. Because thousands of individual firearms were later undeclared, the business share of firearms ultimately surrendered could be significantly higher than 15% of the program. And when the average participating business is turning over roughly 65 firearms, we're clearly not talking about grandpa deciding to surrender his deer rifle. We're talking about inventory, retail inventory, wholesale inventory, inventory that has become commercially worthless overnight. To sign our petition against the federal government's constant scapegoating of law-abiding Canadian gun owners while they fail Canadians in their public safety efforts, please go to handsoffourguns.ca. These businesses legally imported or purchased these firearms for sale. They paid taxes on them. They expected to sell them to licensed Canadians who had passed federal background checks, completed mandatory safety training, and complied with Canada's already extensive and frankly onerous firearms laws. Then Ottawa changed the rules. With the stroke of a pen, inventory that had been perfectly legal to sell suddenly became impossible to sell. Those firearms became what's known as a stranded asset. If you're a retailer, what do? You wait for the government compensation program, not because you're making a political statement, because you're trying to recover at least some of the value of the inventory the government rendered unsellable apropos of nothing. And who can blame them? If Ottawa outlawed the sale of snowmobiles tomorrow, every dealership in Canada would line up for compensation too. So let's not pretend every firearm entering this program represents another dangerous weapon removed from Canadian streets. Many of these firearms weren't on the street or even out of the box. They weren't in criminal hands. They weren't being trafficked. They were sitting in gun shops, locked in warehouses, still in their original boxes, waiting for honest customers who would never legally be allowed to own them. It's not necessarily evidence of a public safety success, right? And then there's the bigger question. If 187 businesses alone accounted for more than 12,000 firearms, how much of this entire exercise is actually functioning as a taxpayer-funded inventory buyout? Because that's what these numbers actually look like. Not panicked Canadians suddenly deciding their firearms were too dangerous to own because Public Safety Minister Gary Nandasangri was so persuasive that he convinced them of their civic duty.
These are firearms designed for war, for killing people. They have no place in our communities.
Businesses are disposing of inventory that politicians transformed into stranded assets. It's really that simple. Meanwhile, police agencies across Canada continue to say that the overwhelming source of crime guns is organized crime and illegal smuggling across the border, not licensed firearms owners like me.
About 90% of the firearms we seized last year came from the U.S.
Toronto Police Association President Clayton Campbell has other ideas to address gun violence.
And more investments at the border. I think ongoing enforcement and money for gang and gun investigations, they're very complex.
License owners weren't the problem before this prohibition. They're still not the problem today. They're the scapegoats. Yet billions of taxpayer dollars are being directed toward compensating licensed owners and retailers while criminals continue obtaining firearms outside the legal market. That's a strange definition of public safety, don't you think? None of this is a criticism of the businesses, however. The question is whether Canadians were ever given an honest picture of what this program actually is.
They're only doing it for political reasons.
What the Minister of Public Safety is doing it right. He's correcting an inefficient system.
If the biggest, clearest numbers we're seeing are commercial inventory payouts rather than confirmed criminal guns removed from the streets, was this ever primarily about public safety? I think we know the answer to that. Or was it always about politics rather than policing? For Rebel News, I'm Sheila Gunn Reid.